freelance writer and journalist, researcher and journalist. Written a book some of you may have seen called The Great University Gamble. And he's kind of known for his trenchant analyses of things like the student loan debacle. Some of you may have seen him on the Daily Politics, in a debate with David Willetts, amongst other people. Andrew's interestingly, Andrew also has a background in fine art. He worked at Central St Martin's. I have to get this right. Working with students on practice-based
PhDs was my first topic. I did that for about 4 years. How to get people through to the end. Yeah.
And he's just recently set up something called the Fine Arts Maths Centre, which I think will actually, maybe when it comes to questions and answers, we'll get him to talk about a little bit, because it sounds really intriguing, given what we've been talking about today in relationship to kind of autodidacticism and so on. And it's an interesting conjunction between mathematics and fine art, which is not necessarily an obvious thing. Anyway, I won't say anything more. Andrew's going to talk probably for about 40 minutes. There's questions and answers afterwards. He's quite happy to have questions asked throughout the discussion, throughout the presentation, and we'll just sort of take it from there. So I'll hand over to Andrew and say thanks very much.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks for the invitation. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to be at the other sessions of this series, although I was quietly in the room this afternoon. I'm kind of over-prepared, as I always do, and then like to sort of change things down once I get a sense of the audience. And I don't want to sort of ruin, shall we say, the vibe that was in the room earlier for those who are in the seminar. So I'm very happy to take interjections. I mean, my own experience here as, a practical autodidact, having to teach myself material that people, largely because other people didn't know it, nobody knew it, things were happening so fast, but also because there were just whole areas where there were no experts who were prepared to talk in public. There were lots of experts employed by banks, credit rating agencies, the government, but they were all paid not to talk about what's going on. And the large sort of aspect I want to talk about is a certain kind of investigative journalism as research, how you get nosy and find out what's going on and do that kind of research, but also at the same time you have to inform yourself about quite technical matters in order to ask the right questions. And a lot of the time it is about asking precise questions, because people, even if they're required to answer because you've put a freedom of information request in front of them, they'll go by the letter of your request. So if you word your request the wrong way, you won't get the information you're after. There's no obligation on them to tell you the truth, the whole truth, etc. There's a lot of dissemblance going on in all manner of aspects of higher education policy. What I'm hoping from this talk, which will be broken up with a film in the middle, it'll appeal to different members of the audience here tonight for different reasons. Some of it will be a kind of practical, how do you do a certain kind of media engagement, how do you investigate technical matters which you're really not supposed to understand because you haven't had the right background, you haven't done an economics degree, you haven't been trained in the Bank of England, you're not a special advisor who understands macroeconomics, and how to present that to a general public. But also some of you understand, study at universities, engage in universities. The content of this should interest you as what's going on in English higher education policy, because that's really where I've specialised. And just to sort of connect to some of the themes earlier, in 2010, I'd just been made redundant twice in the same year from Central St Martin's. They closed the research office where I worked, and my other post was abolished too. And I had some time on my hands, and at the same time, Middlesex, which is where I did my PhD and where I know Andy from, had decided to close its highest rated research department, which was the department where I did my PhD, the Centre of Research in Modern European Philosophy. And that was a complete mystery to me, because I was one of these people who had made the decision to do a PhD at a formal polytechnic in a subject which is traditionally associated with the Brussels Group universities, but Middlesex was one of the highest rated departments, actually demonstrated that formal polytechnics could compete in things like the research assessment exercise, the research action framework on level terms. So why was the university going to close what appeared at the face value to be a success story? And when I worked it out, shall we say, to my satisfaction, It was a bit of a revelation. I realised that I'd been studying or working in universities for about 20 years, but something had fundamentally changed. And what that was the money was moving around the system differently. So people were making decisions for reasons that would have made no sense even 5 years previously. But now, because the money flows are changing, all of the, if you like, the politics and decision-making of it were also changing. So at that point I decided, because I had some time in my hands, to inform myself about the finances. And that was a kind of, if you like, an autodidact project. And I had a bit of a background in housing, so I wasn't completely afraid of numbers or finances, but I had to teach myself accounting, I had to teach myself a number of practices just so I knew to my satisfaction what was going on. And then I began to publish what I was finding in various outlets. I think I'm probably the only person who ever got offered a job on the back of a radical philosophy article. Some of you may get that joke, but others won't. But I published something radical philosophy that went viral on the internet, and I was offered a journalism job on the back of it. And I decided to just jump ship entirely and become a journalist for 5 or 6 months full time, and then I went freelance. So, what I propose to do is mainly to talk about my work with The Guardian over the last 2 years, and I've been working freelance for them on and off. But at the same time, to sort of tell you more about how the research was done, because I think this is a kind of risk in all of these practices, is that I as an individual become an expert, and it becomes very opaque to other people who want to do what I've done, how I did it. I stuck this quote up, wasn't quite sure how academic this thing was going to be, but as it's the 75th anniversary of his death next week, this is a quote that I don't endorse, but it's a quote that troubles me, and I'm quite interested in those of you involved in critical theory. I'm interested in the rebarbative Benjamin, the Benjamin who's quite difficult to deal with. And the reason I pulled this out, because this I think is my own worry, is that really I'm a hack on Benjamin's definition. And he says a hack is anyone who refuses to improve the production apparatus. An appreciable part of the so-called left-wing literature has no other social function than that of continually extracting new effects or sensations from the current situation for the public's entertainment. That second paragraph might be the business plan of The Guardian. And as someone who's worked with it, this is something you struggle with all the time. Most people would define a hack as someone who's an opinion for hire, changes their comments depending on who's paying them, the kind of idea of a polyfiller from private eye. But Benjamin's arguing here that it's actually someone who uses their private opinions and doesn't necessarily divert from that, but does nothing to change the system on which the mainstream media produces news that is the problem. And certainly, some of the stuff I'll show you, my own doubts about it would be that even if I think the information is good information, if I don't think people can use it, then I think it falls back into this idea of entertainment value, not something productive or effective. So I'll show you some stories and you can be the judge at the end as to whether I'm a hack or not. Okay, so there's another Benjamin quote there, but I won't dwell on it. As I said at the beginning, this is what I would understand to be militant research. Is the point of a journalist is not to observe how money moves around higher education differently, because it's an interesting object to analyse, contemplate, become an expert on. The problem is, how do you put information into the system, into the circuits, so that things get prevented, averted, stopped. That's quite a high bar. I think at the moment, maybe when we get to the end, you can kind of say that delaying has probably been the best thing we've been able to do with higher education policy over the last few years. But I think for me, sort of personally, having been on the 2010 protests, certainly the one in December with the vote in Parliament, it became really apparent that people misunderstood what was going on in Parliament. It was seen as a vote on the Brown Review, and that this was somehow going to be a glorious defeat. We tried our best, we would defeat it. When studying policy, studying the money, it became apparent it was only an overture of a much bigger attempt to change the nature of higher education in England. And I think that because people misread that vote in December, a lot of the energy that was there dissipated. People walked away from it, felt, okay, we tried our hardest, when really things were only just beginning for the government. And in some sense, the protests in 2010 did stop the planned higher education bill in 2012, made the Liberal Democrats reluctant to engage in further higher education policy, and it's now, with the new government, we'll see them push on from what they were planning all the way back in 2010, 2011. So that's a sort of bit of context to the motivation behind what I'm about to show you. Okay. So I've got a number of stories here. I probably won't go through all of them, but they're all slightly different, and they all involve different kinds of research, and they all have different angles. One I'll probably talk about most is the Rothschild Review and the Cashburn Colleges. I'll show you the film we did at The Guardian. And this was the first Guardian story which was led by filmmaking. So traditionally a print-based outlet. Obviously online is the big thing for them now, but they've started more and more leading stories with film. And this is the first one where they did that, so I'll show you some clips from those films. You can ask me about any of these things. I might talk a bit about the accounting and budgeting of student loans at the end, if only to emphasise the point that politics is more and more driven by a sort of changing nature of the state, and you can read the changing nature of the state in the way that accounting has changed for government from about 2000. Government is increasingly moving towards private sector accounting conventions, and this is an important way to sort of see what Treasury is worried about, is by understanding how they set the budgets. I might talk a bit about that if people are interested, otherwise I won't concentrate on it too much. Okay, the Rothschild Review. Just a bit of background before we look at the story. In 2010 general election, every political party went into that election planning to sell the student loan book, that is, all the loans they hold on their balance sheet. Even though the Dems were proposing to abolish tuition fees, they were still proposing to sell the loans that had already been issued in order to fund an investment bank. And all of the legislation that was needed to do that was put in place by the Labour government in 2008 with the Sale of Student Loan Act. Labour's original plan was that they would securitise the student loan book and sell £6 billion worth every 2 years. And this is what's known in the trade as an originate-to-distribute model. You originate the loans and then you distribute them to the third parties. They buy them off you after you've made them. As you can imagine, just in 2008 was probably the wrong time to start this kind of business model, and plans were put on hold until 2010 when Mandelson put out a tender bid for consultants to come in and show them alternative routes to the market for sales student loans. So that was put out just before the general election, and the contract was awarded to Rothschild in May, I think, of that year. And Rothschild were asked to look at how do we sell student loans. They're going to be an enormous part of the government's balance sheet. Who's going to buy them off us? Because we don't want it on our balance sheet. And if you go back to the 2011 white paper on higher education, which came out in end of June, the government's really upbeat. And the plan at that point is that they will be able to sell the new loans. They're going to issue the new loans with tuition fees of $9,000. They're going to be able to sell those loans to the private sector. And part of the story here is the government won't tell you what's gone wrong here, that something's gone horribly wrong. The difficulty is trying to work out why they're trying to sell it when they cannot but lose money from it. So, as a result of a Freedom of Information request put out in early 2013, we got hold of this. This is Project Hero, the updated views on the feasibility of the student loan sale. This was the Rothschild report that was commissioned by this. How do we sell this? And this is what it looked like when we got given it. This is probably one of the most legible pages. The redaction in this is a 40-page document, and it had been redacted to, you probably can't see from here, but it's actually clear on PC laptops, is someone had gone through with a black marker and then scanned it into a PDF. Because I had some art school contacts, we were able to put this document into Photoshop, change the shading, and if you have one of these laptops, you can tilt the screen and read the original underneath the blackout. Now, the reason I'm emphasising this is competence. There's all manner of human error in large-scale government departments. This was given to someone very junior, as it was the person with the black pen. Just go through it. You can see the black pen is fading. You can even sort of see it. So immediately there's a hint something's gone wrong here. Now this is a really serious document. There's all manner of stuff in this. And we've transcribed it, put it on the internet. You can find that on the False Economy website. Most of it's technical stuff about which pension funds and insurance companies they were talking to and what they would and wouldn't pay for. There's also a kind of tone of it that's a problem. So that often with these organisations, they're not omnicompetent. They don't see everything. Forces aren't moving in their favour. There are all manner of things, they make mistakes. You just got to be attentive and look for those mistakes. So we took this story to The Guardian. This one of the practical issues here is whether I would write it or whether it would be Aditya. Aditya was known to be a friendly journalist, so always have friendly journalists. I had a book to promote at the time, and if I was promoting the book, I could put my quote in, talk about my book, get some nice advertising, or I could share the byline and get 150 quid. Journalism isn't very well paid. So I made the decision to do it that way. But you can see that what the report was proposing was raise interest rates on loans that had already been issued. So all the loans go back to 1998. I think we had 100,000 hits in 24 hours on this story. We were only beaten on the Guardian website by a Japanese eyeball-looking fetish website. And if you go to the Guardian offices, the first thing you see in the lobby is a tracker of which pages are getting hits in real time, updating all the time. It's quite fascinating to be inside that environment. But the kind of key thing, and this is from the same story, is that the authors of the report, Rothschild, ventriloquize. They say to the government, this is what you should do. You should go to students and say, we all live in difficult times. You have a deal which is so much better than your younger siblings, like they didn't have 9,000 fees, and we've got to go back to them and persuade them they should agree to change their interest rates. And then obviously what's interesting here about the language is the admission 9,000 tuition fees is much worse than what we had before, and just this suggestion that you would kind of get people to do it for your country. That you would pay more on your student loan, you would accept more interest rates because the austerity required it. I think I've got this on the next page, is the same story. Rothschild on this slide here suggested the abolition of the cap, and they say the financial risk is best taken by the government, then it's best taken by graduates, and lastly by investors. Investors don't want these risks, and they're not going to buy it off you for those risks. So you've got to give them what they want. You've got to protect them and sell them something nice, safe, and vanilla. And the way you do that is by making graduates pay more. Now, this is 2013. 4 days later, after we put the story to them, Hinds Cable suddenly remembered they'd ruled out this option. But the new government, Conservative government, has gone back to these ideas, and those of you who've started university since 2012 in England, I encourage you to look at the consultation the government put out over the summer, which is to go back to everyone who started since 2012 and change the terms on your loans so that the repayment threshold will be frozen at £21,000 for 5 years. So when you took out a loan, all the information on the government's website said that repayment threshold will go up in line with average earnings from 2017. This will mean if you have started university since then, and this applies to your current students as well if you're a lecturer, you effectively add about £300 a year for the next 30 years to every current and new student coming in. And that will largely fall on middle and low earners. And it's effectively a retrospective price hike. The consultation closes on October the 14th. The reason there's a consultation is the government recognises this is a change of intention, but they haven't gone round. Your university hasn't asked you to tell your students about this. They probably haven't even told you about it if you're an academic member of staff. But that's what's happening, is people are effectively going to have to pay more for something they signed up to 4 years ago. I didn't talk about the synthetic hedge. I can come back to that if people have got questions. One of the other things I had to learn about quite quickly was complex financial derivatives in order to see how the government was trying to sell student loans. And as I said, we put the full transcript of the report. Interestingly, I don't know any academic research that's gone and used, any academics have gone and used that transcript. It's a mine of information if you're interested in how the state works and how they understand managing the assets that they increasingly hold. So because governments are moving away from funding everything through current expenditure, or in-year expenditure, and moving to asset-based forms, their balance sheets are changing. And this is quite interesting about all the comments on all the technical feedback from pension funds and insurance companies about those aspects. So in July last year, Vince Cable vetoed the sale of student loans, despite George Osborne saying it was government policy. But they kept including the projection of student loan receipts in every official projection. So the OBR figures still show it, and George Osborne's claim that debt will be falling as a percentage of GDP by March depends on beginning a student loan sale. It's a difficult, secretive area. Government will never talk about it. But what's interesting now, and this is perhaps another aspect about journalism, is it's very hard to sell this story, which is they should have made an announcement by now if George Osborne's target for debt to be falling by the end of March is to be complete. Because officials have 9 months to get the sale done. It's got to be done by March. We're now in September. There's another delay in here that they won't talk about. So if you remember that George Osborne went to the electorate saying, I'm going to meet my secondary fiscal mandate, I will have debt falling as a percentage of GDP. It doesn't look like he will now, because this sale isn't going to go through. Anyway. I want to sort of emphasise a couple of things here. This is integral to government policy, this sale. A lot of people think, sale of student loans, it's a minor aspect of higher education policy, but it's actually now central to whether the government meets its fiscal mandate in the near future. So there'll be a lot of pressure to sell it, and I think the main reason Sajid Javid is business secretary is because he has a banking background and will be able to assess the sale better than someone like Cable, and is more likely, more inclined to say yes. But the losses here could be the equivalent of the losses on Royal Mail every year in perpetuity. So it's something they'd rather you didn't look at too closely or know about. Okay. This is not such an interesting story, I think, although I just flagged this up because 2 years ago we were leaked stuff from inside Whitehall, and it showed the department modelling emergency cuts to higher education, and those cuts were sort of the order of 600 million, 800 million. Everything they did for that modelling is what they're looking at the moment for the comprehensive spending review, and that did involve hits to research. The other thing here is the only reason, sometimes you write these stories and then no one believes you in the end because those cuts never came through. The only reason these cuts didn't come through is the Treasury relented and allowed them to change the way they accounted and budgeted for student loans. So there's, again, all these things that they don't put out press releases for. They changed the whole way in which student loans appear in the budgets, and that's the third time. It's the third iteration of that accounting since 2010. They keep changing these things because they've got these long-term problems that they want to keep from immediate political perception. This is a separate story. This might look rather dull, but again, it emphasises this point about competency. This is a table from the 2013 Autumn Statement. So it's a document that comes from the Treasury. Teams of experts, extremely well-educated people. Buried in the numbers is this table here. What this table reportedly shows is that if you put in the gross proceeds from the sale of the student loan book, we get in 2.3 billion, and we get another 2.3 billion, and we get another 2.3, another 2.3. Then all of these other policies, the abolition of recruitment caps on higher education, green investment bank, startup loan, etc., it's all cash neutral. And that because you've sold the student loans, this other stuff doesn't affect cash flow. In fact, you're £65 million up. It looks very impressive. It's very hard to argue with these things in some cases. You want to say, well, yes, of course we want more people to go to higher education. I'm quite interested in the idea of a green investment bank. And you've made it fiscally neutral. There's an important thing that was missing from this table, though, which, again, is this, to emphasise the point about competence and paying attention. The government forgot that if you sell the student loans, the income that you were expecting to come in is no longer coming to you, the government. It's going to the people who bought the student loan. So there's a big change missing from here, which is that £1.7 billion isn't coming into government anymore because it's precisely that which you've sold to the private sector. So again, something slightly different point I'd emphasise. This was too technical for The Guardian. It's just a numbers thing. So I have a blog where I do a lot of the more technical financial stuff as the mainstream media. We'll eventually pick it up, but you want to have a precipitation strategy. Sometimes you want to put stories out there because people don't want to talk about them, and you stick it out there and you force them to talk about it because it's now in the public domain. But you've got to be pretty confident that you've read stuff correctly to do that. Fortunately, the OBR. Now, there's a lot of critics of the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, but my God, they're thorough. They don't make those kind of mistakes for some reason. And I found this paragraph in the OBR's accompanying report, which says that the additional outlay of loans over the forecast period will more than be financed by proceeds from the sale of the pre-reform income contingency loan book. Taking the student together, there'll be net debt. But they go on to say, selling the student loan book reduces repayments over the later years of the medium-term forecast by just under £1 billion and beyond. So there's a whole billion a year that they forgot to include in 2018. And I went to the OBR press office. They were very happy to give me these other figures, that in 2016 it was 200 million, in 2017-18 it was 500 million. The next time I went back for clarification, they'd obviously been instructed to shut the fuck up, because that meant I was able to say the government left out £1.7 billion from its assessment of the fiscal impact. So 2 days later, the FT ran with the story. There was a Treasury Select Committee, and George Osborne was forced to admit that the sale of the student loan book would not fund the plan to expand student numbers. So not just, it wouldn't fund the Green Investment Bank and all other things, it wouldn't even fund the first thing on that table, which was the expansion of student numbers. The IFS then came out and said it was all economic nonsense anyway, blah, blah. Interestingly, and I have a very low opinion of David Willett, he went to another select committee and said, we did not commit the schoolboy howlers that McGettigan accused us of. But the defence, his defence was then he said, go and look at the OBR table. That we didn't leave it out. But my whole point was, yeah, that's where it is. It's not in the other stuff. So they kind of admitted that the information was the right information, it just wasn't in the right place, and it didn't support the claims that George Osborne was making. Now, there's no complicated mathematics there. It's just a case of going how the loans work. The income from them has gone somewhere else. And it's just a case of adding 1 billion, 200 million, and 500 million to get to that figure of 1.7 billion. That's what I would emphasise. Is a lot of these large corporations, similar to government, will stick a whole lot of stuff in your face and go, feel the weight of that, look at all those numbers. But if most of the maths behind it is particularly in accounting, is just addition and subtraction. And as long as you're kind of careful and go through it and ask the right questions and know where to look, and sometimes get a bit of help, you can work your way around it. And often, I think this is one of the biggest difficulties for left politics, progressive organisation, is the numbers side. I would always recommend trying to find a friendly accountant, or at least someone who's familiar with numbers, to help you do this stuff. Because really, this is, in government and large institutions, try to set the terrain on which these debates occur, and increasingly they use the financial business case to rebut you. But it's also the case where they're least competent. I mean, think of your favourite manager. Think of how good they are at numbers. I've been in senior university meetings where I had to explain what the difference between percentages and percentage points was. What's the difference between average and marginal costs? People do not know the numbers. And so they're hoping you don't ask them the questions about the numbers or interrogate them too hard. And that here applies to the Treasury. Not, one of the most competent, you would think, institutions in the country on this score. So, more power to your elbow. Keep asking the right questions and don't be put off by the numbers that are put in front of you, because more often than not they're partial and they may just have some real big errors in them. Okay, I've just wanted to emphasise two things from there. higher education policy is increasingly finance-driven. I don't think, in an ideal world, no one would do what I do. It shouldn't be what it's about, but unfortunately it is. But I emphasise that it's not that hard to teach yourself accounting. There's actually some very good guidebooks online, and it's a perfect group exercise is to download your institution's accounts. If it's a university, they have to put the last 5 years of all their accounts up. They're all required to use a standard format, so one university's account looks exactly like the others. Ignore the first 80 pages, because that's all the PR bump. Go to the notes, that's where all the technical requirement stuff is. There's a handy 20-page guide put out by an organisation called JNCHES, JNCHES, which is the Joint Negotiating Committee for University Salaries and Pensions. And that will just walk you through how to read accounts. I really recommend it as a group exercise of just teaching yourself accounts by reading your own institutions. This is the stuff I'm about to show you is a separate matter. There are kind of two prongs to the government's higher education policy in England. One is how do we make the numbers add up given the austerity requirement? A lot of moving from grants to loans is about getting the accounts to work and the budgets to work in a certain way. The other aspect is liberalising the market. And this is the subject of quite a long investigation we did with the Guardian. Very different kind of research, but again, largely accounts driven, because if you go and find these companies and you read through their accounts, you kind of go, how did they grow so much, so quickly? Apologise for the photo of Liam Byrne. This may be something that we want to talk about when the cameras are off, but at a certain point I began to have a lot of contact with the Labour front bench prior to the election. And one of the things they did was they would come to me with their parliamentary questions and say, how can we tighten these up? A bit like I said about freedom of information questions, you want to get the wording right, because the government will give you precisely what you've asked for, and that may not be what you want. So back in March last year, I helped Liam Byrne draft some very precise questions about the expansion of private higher education in England. One of the advantages I had is I live in Whitechapel, and this is like the epicentre. I could see these colleges springing up everywhere. We couldn't possibly believe how many students they were supposed to have. And eventually we got this information out that the government was predicting that £900 million a year was going to be going to undergraduates at private higher education colleges. That's almost 8 to 9% of the entire funded undergraduate provision in the UK. So back in 2011, and this was the article I wrote for Radical Philosophy, I said this is what's going to happen. It was a tiny proportion of the market. It was less than 0.5% of funded undergraduate provision in England was at private for-profit institutions in May. And then in 2 years, the government managed to turn that, grow it 25-fold by relaxing all kind of market restrictions on alternative providers. Liam Byrne managed to get his question right. We managed to get this out of government, and this is kind of what we got in the end from the National Audit Office. Here you can see in 2010-11 the number of students receiving grants, tuition fee loans, maintenance loans for undergraduate study at alternative providers. There's only 6,000 of them in 2010-11, and they were getting, I think it's about 40 million. This is in millions on the side. Oh, we need a plug, I think. Okay, that should work. So this is market expansion. This is how market liberalisation works. If you conceive of universities as a state monopoly, a vested interest defending a sector for no good reason, then this is the trajectory they were seeking. So from this point where there's about £40 million going to, sorry, it's less, it's about £30 million, £40 million going to 6,000 students. 4 years later, you've got £700 million going to 52,000 students. and that was projected to go to 900 million last year. We haven't got the official figures yet. It'll probably be something of that region. I'll just show you what that entails. This is it's a London phenomenon, by and large. So these are the biggest London universities by the number of funded students who are taking maintenance loans. So the ones in purple are the ones I doubt you've ever heard of. So St Patrick's College, who's heard of that? And it has. It's got more funded students than UCL. In 2011 it had 50. Now it has 7,000. Greenwich, GSM is Greenwich School of Management. Went from having about 200 students in 2011 to having 6,000 funded students. LSBF, London School of Business and Finance, it had 50 funded students. Sorry, yes.
So by funded, you mean people who are taking out maintenance loans?
Yeah,
okay.
For undergraduate study.
Okay. Yes.
So LSBF had 50. 3 years later, it has 4,500. And you can see the size of them. LSBF is now bigger than Royal Holloway. St Patrick's is bigger than UCL, and you've never heard of them. It's gone from nothing to enormous in a few years. BITE is the British Institute of Technology and Education. Well, the question I asked, and this is what oriented my search, is how on earth do you do this? Where do you get those students? How do you... Okay, the government's let you do it, but where were they? It's not as if those students were at university and have decided to go elsewhere. Where have they got these students? Does anyone have a sense of...
Abroad?
No, these are all funded students. These are all home or EUs. These are taking out maintenance loans, so these are all home students.
And close FE colleges?
Yeah, there's a sense in which the government shut down FE. These colleges were catering to international students, and that was contracted by the Home Office, so they went to a different market. But it's two different sets of students.
Are these actually for undergraduate degrees?
It's for HNCs and HNDs and some undergraduate degrees. Degrees at Greenwich School of Management are validated by Plymouth University. St Patrick's was largely doing HNCs and HNDs. Yeah.
Do they actually exist?
Well, that is one question. And you'll see a bit of that in the film. I'll show you. What we realised is they were recruiting outside job centres and shopping malls. Whose computer is this? I thought I'd switched on the power. I think it's through what I've got. I've got a battery message, but I thought I'd switched on the plug. Is it this plug? Yes, there was a specialist recruitment agent called Opportunity Network that was effectively a chugger outside job centres and at shopping malls, going up to people and saying, have you considered higher education? Particularly outside job centres, and I've got Facebook out, Gumtree out to say similar things. It's kind of like student loan in London, if you are, of a certain income, is worth £8,000. Grant is worth £4,000. So it's £12,000 a year for these people for studying. And if you stand outside job centres and you're basically, it's much higher money than job seekers allowance, and you don't get told to apply for jobs every hour that you're alive. Okay.
Required to go as part. Yes.
Well, you'll see from the film, if we can get it up, this aspect that it's not quite clear. There's all manner of things going on, but basically, if the college is getting £6,000 in the tuition fee, and the students are getting £12,000 in a mixture of loans and grants, they might have come to an arrangement. But also the standards that were supposed to be applied to take people in were obviously not being followed. So I don't know if anyone's involved in student recruitment, but Pearson, for example, in its HNC and HND, didn't set a minimum TEFL requirement. So you had a lot of them were recruiting EU students, just asking for 4 or 4.5 on TEFL, which would be someone who would struggle with GCSE. It's just there. I don't know if anyone has a spare laptop, I can show you the film. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is it working now? Is it working?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to show you is, because we've done the earlier work on the numbers, we started getting lots of whistleblowers. We started getting lots of unsolicited email from people who've been working at these places. The problem was we just got so many of them. It was, quite a chore to work through them, work out which colleges to concentrate on. Obviously the other thing we did was we went through lots of publicly available accounts to try and work out where the biggest stories would be. We tried to get as many figures as possible because in this kind of activity you're getting into libel territory. Councils and government cannot sue you for libel. No one knows if universities can sue you for libel. There's not been the appropriate test case. Some people think universities are a bit like councils. Other people say they're private corporations, so you can libel universities. These are for-profit businesses, so you're definitely, if you start writing about for-profit companies, libel is something you have to deal with. And that's why it's useful getting into bed with big media companies, because they have legal departments that help you on this stuff. Eventually, we published a series of films. As I said, this is the first sort of film-led dark investigation. There was also stuff in papers, and you probably can't read this bit here, but the college we ran the first story on was known locally as the ATM because it was so easy to get cash from it. And you can see this guy saying the common knowledge about this uni is that it's a good way to get money. We'll try and get that footage up. Because what we decided to do was to go in undercover to try and just get a bit more information about what was going on. One of the things I've been sort of arguing for a while is that this is subprime education in the same way that we talk about subprime mortgages. This is education being sold to communities with very little familiarity with higher education. London School of Science and Technology is most definitely not a uni, but that's what people going there thought they were getting. They thought they were getting the equivalent of higher education. So this is a bit of film. I'll show about 3 minutes of this so you get a sense of it. Includes whistleblowers and it's an 11-minute film, and there's about 3 other films, I think.
£13 million in loans and grants. This year, it'll be even more.
So this is...
Several lecturers have come forward to allege that highly questionable practices fueled this rapid growth.
They were taking on large numbers of students that were inadequately prepared academically. We'd give them a test, they had to get 40%. But I had many reports of the admission staff actually helping students.
We had students achieving 2% and 4%, and they were still being admitted. We had students who could not speak English. We had students who could not use a computer. It was rogue and rotten to the core. These are serious allegations, so, posing as a student, I decided to pay them a visit. This college now has about 1,500 students on board, but walking around, the first question that struck me was, where are they all?
This college has about 1,500 students.
When you have a look at things like attendance registers, you're talking 20, 30%.
Sorry, is there a class supposed to be going on in here?
Yes,
Do you know which one it is?
it's OB.
OB, what?
Organizing and behavior.
Behaviour, right, okay.
This class began 35 minutes ago. but no students have turned up.
Okay. Oh, it's no one here.
Well,
Okay.
maybe the last week was maybe this was getting ready for
LSST told us submissions week would have been extremely quiet, as many students submit work from home. But others have claimed that low attendance was an ongoing problem. It was strange. I would walk past classrooms, and I'm accustomed to walking past classrooms and hearing banter, voices. And most of the time, I would just hear a lecturer's voice, or in some cases, no voices. And I'd poke my head into a classroom, and out of a class that was supposed to be between 25 and 35 students, there'd be 1, 2, or 3, on a good day, probably 8. Why would the college want to enrol lots of unqualified students who don't turn up to class?
To maximise income, they keep students on roll as long as possible to maximise their funding.
The college gets £6,000 in tuition fees a year. Students can get up to £11,000 in loans and grants. They have to pay the loans back, but only if they earn £21,000 a year. All of this is coming out of government coffers. I spoke to several students who are turning up and trying their best. Many of them feel the college is letting them down.
What's it like around here, by the way? Because I just started, so... Yeah.
It's pretty shit, to be honest. Don't know what they do here. Don't have a good screening process. Handling computers. Right. Don't have no qualifications, but I know about computers. But other people that don't have the mouse or don't know what a cursor is.
everyone's being treated at the same level.
Same level.
Fair. I'm hurrying on here, expressing around.
A couple of students had no complaints.
What's it like then? What do you feel? It's good? You like it? Okay.
For teachers, pupils, everything's fine. Okay. Only yourself, how community, how you yourself try to best for yourself.
But what's really surprising is that many of those who are turning up seem to know about the college's absent students.
Some people only sign up and get the money, man. Straight up. Common knowledge about this uni is a good way to get money. That's fucking great, man. Then you get to learn something if you want.
Yeah.
If you want. If you want, that's that point.
You would have taken the money. Not coming. They're getting paid as well, so they don't give a fuck.
You might be surprised. The reference, or the name it has on the street, that name is the ATM, or the cash point. It turns out some of this cash was being withdrawn by students from Europe.
I spoke to one student from Romania. What did they tell you?
Well, studying at LSST is fantastic. I get on a plane, I come to London of all places, I stay for a week or two, then I go back home. I get my student loan. I make more money doing this than I would back home. In November, the government began investigating suspicious foreign students. We've established that at LSST alone, 300 of them have been struck off roll as a result.
So, I've been here for a couple of days now, and what's clear is that the tragedy isn't just that public money is going to an institution that can't seem to organise its own lectures, has no basic admissions process, but what's the most heartbreaking part about all of this is that there are genuine students there who really do want to learn, and they're the ones who are really being let down by all of this.
There were some students that really worked hard, that came out with all distinctions, but if you look at the...
I'll stop it there. It's all online. Fortunately, the lawyers have ensured none of this had to be taken down. And there's kind of more in that vein. There's sort of other colleges that we looked into. I recently did a Radio 4 programme on St Patrick's. Similar stories and worse stories in some ways, and other colleges as well. What's fascinating to me in a certain sense is we're talking large amounts of money, and there's money that's coming out of the HE budget, and the universities haven't made a squeak about this. I think many of them thought that as long as it doesn't impinge on them, it's not their business of what goes on elsewhere in higher education. But this is, the budgetary pressures facing higher education, large parts of it are now going to a sector we don't know anything about. We've got no idea about the quality, and what we do know about it is that it's not very good. The thing is, this is 30 times bigger than the money going to something like Kids Company, which has been all over all over the press. I think that obviously has other dimensions to do with celebrity, prime minister, sign-off, but this is one of these stories where, in some sense, I'm sort of disappointed I couldn't get more push on this, because we're talking enormous amounts of money. We're talking about probably the biggest failure of the last government, much bigger failure than anything else. The last thing I can think of that's equivalent is the individual learning account scandal from the early 2000s. And this is what sort of marketisation looks like. If you want to allow these alternative providers in the system, how do you control the quality? Some of you may have seen Joe Johnson's speech last week to Universities UK, and he said, I'm going to liberalise this further. It's really terrible what's happening with universities. It's as if when Byron burgers wanted to set up their new hamburger store, they had to get Burger King's permission. We think there shouldn't be this regulation. And I'm familiar with Michael Gove and people like this who's got a mix of bumptious opportunism, utter cynicism. They just tell you something you know they can't believe, but they've got the power to say it to your face and sort of laugh about it afterwards. Joe Johnson did something very similar, going to Universities UK and saying, you're like the fast food sector, but you've got more protections. Now that's extremely dangerous and worrying, but also one of the problems is how do you get sort of increasing accountability on this? I think one of the naive ideas I had about journalism is if you just put the information out there, it's a good story, it would kind of run and have its own legs, every other newspaper would kind of pick it up. And that doesn't happen for reasons perhaps we might discuss afterwards. I think I'll just want to get back to this. Yeah, so the main things we discovered was the department responsible did not monitor the progression of funded students at private provider colleges. The student loans company gave these students money. They gave them money as if they were full-time students and they should have completed an HND in 2 years. But nobody matched up completion rates against the funding. So those of you familiar with higher education setup, with universities, this would all be going through something like HESA, the Higher Education Statistics Agency. These private providers are right outside of that. So nobody is able to ask the question, we've given all this money, how many students have completed? I believe that LSST, which had had thousands of students since 2011, had graduated 10 students successfully in that period. And I think that when we finally get these numbers, I think it will be astonishing. I think completion rates will be 20% would be good, I think, of the funding. The key thing was that Pearson, on the HND, allowed students 5 years to get the qualification. It treated them all as part-time students and had no record of whether they were funded by government or not. So there's no flags. Yeah.
When you say Pearson, is that Pearson as in the major global?
Yeah, Pearson and Excel, yeah.
Okay.
So they own Excel, which owns the HND, HNC qualification in England. And there was just no track record was asked. I think at one point the government was just doing a paperwork exercise. It was signing off all these courses for student loans. We did about 100 a day, I think, on a typical day. Right, so one of the good things that did come out is that I met with Margaret Hodge and I talked through a whole load of statistics that aren't in the film, and she called for a National Audit Office investigation, and that report appeared in December, and it led to 2 Public Accounts Committee hearings, and eventually BIS had to kind of publish a whole load of revised guidance and tighten up a whole load of things that should have been tightened up beforehand. I think my sort of big disappointment about engaging with things like the parliamentary committees is no matter what you give them, they're just unable to ask the right follow-up questions. So they can read all the information you've given them and ask the right first question. They have no idea how to press these questions. I think this is a sort of bigger problem, which is maybe the competency of our parliament and what that means for politics. And a big topic to raise, but that's one of the things I've learned is we really have to sort of create our own alternative systems of accountability, and it's very, very hard to sort of try and cobble that together with what's there. But often, someone like Margaret Hodge, who I've a lot of time for, but often it's more heat than light. There's a lot of berating of people in front of her, but you don't get to the heart of the matter.
I'm wondering if you can think of a reason for the government to be complicit in this. I taught English to speakers of other languages in London from sort of 2000 to 2010 or so. In 2000, when I began, I could be paid 17, 18 pounds an hour for a lecture of ESOL. By the time it came to 2007, 2008, lecturers in my position were being offered minimum wage, £6 an hour, to stand in front of empty classrooms like that. And that was because of the allocation of student visas to large numbers of students who would then come in, get part-time jobs, and provide cheap labour to the economy of London. So the government wasn't concerned that these colleges were not real colleges, and they were just the facilitation of bringing cheap labour to the country. So that was good for people who need cheap labour, was good for the owners of the businesses processing their applications, but was not good for lecturers in positions as they may be probably called paid lecturers at colleges you're talking about. But there's like a clear incentive for the government to turn a blind eye to that. So I'm wondering if there could be some incentive which encourages the government to be complicit in this sort of operation.
My sort of quick response to that would be the Home Office really clamped down on the FE provision and the international students because Theresa May had the target of bringing down migration below 100,000. And it's a bit like whack-a-mole. A lot of these colleges used to be in that game. The Home Office closed that down, and then the other opportunity arose.
But once it had become
but what I would say is that there's some real ideologues in government, and if you cut David Willits, it would say, I believe in markets. He really believes that market competition is absent from higher education, and you have to bring in these providers to shake things up. I think Joe Johnson, from that last quote, I'm going to blow open the English higher education market. This is what he said last week. They believe that that's the reason you have low student satisfaction in some places is because they're insufficiently exposed to competition, and we need to bring in these new, thrusting insurgents. I think one of them will be to start challenging the established order. So I think there's an ideology there. I think they didn't realise how low some of these colleges would go, and I certainly think they expected to see innovation around 2-year degrees, teaching through summer, cheap provision so that students were only paying £5,000 a year maybe for tuition fees and you would graduate. That's where they were expecting the innovation. I don't think they were expecting chuggers outside job centres. I think it's just unanticipated in that sense. But I think they now believe they've responded to this and tightened it up. I've kind of gone over time with the... Okay. I thought I might just talk a bit about what I've been doing recently, because it's not well known and I think it's important to know it, if that's okay. This is my latest pamphlet, the accounting and budgeting of student loans, and I did this at the Higher Education Policy Institute. Largely I just became absolutely fascinated by the Treasury and I wanted to find a way in. And so I agreed to write a report for the Higher Education Policy Institute, which meant I was able to go into the Treasury and interview their higher education team about what they were doing when they were changing the budgeting all the time. What was the purpose of this? Personally, I think I found it very revealing. It's a very technical pamphlet and it was kind of pitched as, you might have heard about the RAB charge, the Resource Accounting and Budgeting Charge, which is the government's estimate of how much money will not be paid back by students. There's been a lot of confusion about it, so I kind of wrote a primer to it. But I think there's something else in there, which is about the changing nature of the state. And practically, by understanding the budgeting, you understand what the Treasury is trying to achieve and what it's concerned about. And this is what it's concerned about. This is maybe a slightly out-of-date chart, but I always use official government figures. I always either use OBR, or I also use IFS, or I use government figures, because you don't want to get into an argument with government about the figures. If it's their figures, then they've got to accept that bit, and then you can build from that. This is the projection of cash repayments on student loans. And this is a percentage of GDP. GDP is roughly 1.8 trillion at the moment, so in today's figures here, it's about £7-8 billion a year is expected to be coming back from all of the student loan repayments that have ever been, from all the loans that have ever been issued. We're here, at the moment there's a sort of tiny amount English loan repayments coming in, about 1.5 billion a year. And when we get to the mid-2040s, it will have stabilised. So one of the things I think people assume is that the student loan scheme is up and running. The student loan scheme doesn't hit operational maturity until here, 2045. This is when all of the loans in existence are generating a substantial number of repayments. Here is that this all has to be funded from government borrowing up front. So the government has to kickstart, pump prime the student loan scheme. Until repayments reach a suitable level, it's got to be putting lots of money into the system to get it going. So in the short term, there's very little difference in terms of government cash flows about whether you're issuing grants or issuing loans. Loans are advantageous because the money comes back, but we're talking about loans with huge lifetimes and, from the Treasury's point of view, generous repayment terms. The savings the government gets on loans involve booking the repayments 30 years in the future today and saying we're going to save this much money because we expect all this money to come back over the next 30 years. It's a fundamentally volatile assumption, and this is what the Treasury is worried about. It's not worried about the deficit, it's worried about a certain kind of cash flow problem and whether the projections are robust. I ran over that quite quickly. Yeah.
Is that based on all students going into employment and actually paying back at a decent rate, or?
It's based on, they have a big database with about 20,000 students in it, which are based on earnings, lifetime earnings profile from all manner of places. They pull the data in and they build a database and then they run policy over the top of it. So there's all manner of assumptions in there about and what different kinds of graduate over a lifetime. Right?
Just lots of students kind of particular economy.
Yeah, it assumes we return to growth after 2020 and have a stable, 2% earnings growth over inflation. There's all manner of assumptions built into this. That's not working. So, in many ways, when people say what do loans cost the government, it's the wrong question. Loans have long lifetimes. People just do not know. No one can tell you what the cost of loan is going to be, because we're talking about enormous numbers of variables that everyone's making sort of best guesses on. But look, I like this quote from Cable. I don't worry about it because in a sense these losses crystallise in 30, 40 years' time when I'll be well over 100. I like to think of this as, those of you into intergenerational politics, I like to think of this as the classic expression of intergenerational thinking in the government. But it's true in a certain sense. The losses, we don't know what the losses will be until 30, 40 years' time. It's just we're making a punt on it now. And the problem is for the Treasury is that these are volatile, uncertain assets, and the Treasury is worried that we're piling on 10, 12, 15, 20 billion pounds student loans a year, every year for the next, course of this Parliament. Will the repayments materialise? And even if the repayments do materialise, there's a big impact on the balance sheet now. So the right question is not what will they cost, but what's the government budgeted for it? And what does the budgeting tell you about what they want to happen? And what happens if the budget allocation is wrong? We'll find out all of this in November when we get the comprehensive spending review. Everyone will have to say, this is what we want student loans to do. Here's the same chart. And this is the additions to public sector net debt, just to do with English student loans. Again, this is percentage of GDP. GDP is about 1.8 trillion. So this is about, this would be 180 billion. This is about 150 billion. So what happens is, because you've got to do all the borrowing for student loans, until this is when the repayments start to stabilise. This is operational maturity on the previous chart. This is the impact on net debt. It's going to add about 180 billion just over the next couple of decades.
Are these repayments now coming back to the government because they're no longer selling?
No, it stops growing when repayments start coming in. So this is the borrowing. It's the additional debt on the government's balance sheet as it front loads the student loan scheme. So it's currently issuing £14 billion a year. It's only getting 1.5 billion back. So it has to borrow 12.5 billion to make up that shortfall. That will add. That's why there's a sharp incline at the beginning because borrowing at the early days is quite heavy until repayments start to reach a level. So if we go back to this.
So the repayments are coming back to the government or to the people who bought the student?
Well, at this point, this is without, if a sale doesn't go ahead. This will all change if a sale goes ahead. But this is why they want to sell, to get this debt off the balance sheet. Okay, again, I mentioned earlier this practical proposal the government's currently consulting on. This is why they want to freeze your repayment threshold if you are a student. The dark green is the current system, and this is the lifetime's earning distributions of graduates. So the figures we've just looked at broken down into from the least, those are the lowest incomes to those are the richest. And a repayment threshold freeze doesn't sound like very much. You know, it's going to be 21,000 for 5 years, but because these are 30-year loans, if you make that freeze early, it has implications for every payment subsequently. So green is what happens with the repayment freeze. You can see that everybody in the lower deciles sees a sharp increase in the amount they will repay over their lifetime. So here, this is about £5,000. It's an extra 25% cost on your degree than you would have thought when you started in 2012. For those sort of average earnings, they're going to go from paying back just under 25 to up to 30. So it's significant. If you have got a student loan, or you've got students who've got student loans, you know, this is money in your pocket that's going to go. It's probably about, if you think about it as an extra £300 a year for the next 30 years, additional to what you were promised when you signed up to student loans. But the reason the government are doing this is because they're so worried about this. I won't talk about university finances because that's a different issue. But I would emphasise is that this is where the politics should be. But it's technical. The consultation was put out over the summer. They didn't go around and announce. They didn't write to you all individually as a student borrower and say, we're going to consult on this. They're just hoping you don't spot it in a certain sense. So I encourage everybody to contribute to that consultation. They've got an event at the weekend, but they've been concentrating on the abolition of maintenance grants, which comes in the new start, affects new starters in 2016. And you can see from this chart that replacing grants with loans, that's the sort of olive in the middle, has very little impact for low earners. It's only if you come from a poorer background and then become a high earner that additional debt makes much impact on your payments. I think this is like a perfect tax on social mobility grants. It's really, you only see it if you end up as a high earner that you impact. But this is dragging up. The reason there's such a big impact up here, but not an impact down here, is that there's a minority of people who are getting full maintenance grants who then become on to be high earners. They're paying so much extra that they're dragging up the whole cohort of high earners. I think the maintenance grant is easier to organise around politically, but the freeze is retrospective, so I think it's more serious.
How soon will be published on the student? What will you have it being made available to students?
Well, the government put the announcement on its website.
And
that's it. Some of us have made some effort. Martin Lewis is about to do something on it. The NUS is being persuaded to engage in this. I don't really understand the NUS position, except sometimes I think they find it difficult to differentiate, to get clear whether they're responsible for the impact on graduates. Maintenance grants affect students while they're students, in one sense, and this affects people who are graduates. And what sense does the NUS have responsibility towards graduates rather than current students? It's a difficult, it's not a clear question for them. It's, in many ways, not a question they've had to think about before, because this is a policy that's, loans is a relatively recent policy on this scale. So there's a hand up there. Yeah.
Okay, I don't really know anything about numbers, and I would like to understand. If we're freezing it at 21,000, why does that increase the amount of money that you're paying back?
Okay, so The original proposal, and it's what you would, when you signed up for student loans, what it said would do is that it would be 21,000 in 2016, and then in 2017 it would go up in line with average earnings, so it would increase by a percentage amount. So the threshold would, let's say, be 21,200, around 21,000. Because the threshold is higher, and you repay a percentage of your income above that threshold, if the threshold goes up, the amount you're repaying is reduced, and your salary stays the same, the amount you repay reduces accordingly. If you freeze the threshold for 5 years, more people cross the threshold, presuming that their incomes are going up, but they also pay a larger amount back, because the threshold doesn't just determine whether you pay or not, it determines how much you pay. So if you freeze it, people cross it, and people who are getting salary increases have to pay a larger increase. If your salary increase is in line with the threshold, the amount you're paying back will stay relatively static. So, I mean, that's one of the tricks here. Is when we wrote about changing interest rates on student loans retrospectively, you get 100,000 hits in a day, because everybody has an understanding of what interest rates are. Repayment thresholds, you don't normally have repayment thresholds on loans, you only have them on student loans. Most people's familiarity with loans is taking a loan out to buy a house or taking a loan out to buy a car, and you clear your balance in a fixed period. It's not, you don't take out a loan for a car and then go back to the people who gave you loans and say, I'm not earning over £21,000. These are a new kind of loan that we don't really have. We don't really understand. We don't really have the political apparatus to deal with it in a certain sense, or it's forming as we speak. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
How's it affecting employers offering wages? Are they building that into the graduate level wages? Are they offering 21,000 because of that?
I think some employers are offering. So some teaching posts I've seen, or teacher training posts I've seen, have been tied to writing a certain amount off your student loan balance. I think that's not a great. It looks appealing, but it's not really a great deal in many ways. The thing is, if you stay below the threshold, you never repay back anything.
It's an incentive.
But some people, there's a whole manner of complicated debates here. People psychologically want to clear their loan balance, but if you do clear your loan balance, you end up paying much more in repayment. So the people who clear their loan balances are these people up here who are paying twice as much or more than people who don't. But that debt it's a debt, and it will follow you around. There'll be a number attached to your student loan. You may never have to repay anything on it, but psychologically, everyone would probably prefer not to have it at all. It's stuff we don't really have. We don't have much of a practical sense about it, I think. I always say to people, don't make extra repayments on your student loans, because there's an insurance scheme built into student loans that isn't in other kinds of loans, that you would lose if you paid it off early, things like this. Yeah.
What's the legalities of the retrospective proposed changing terms and conditions? I mean, I was thinking that perhaps part of the incentive is to create that sense of uncertainty by imposing something that seems, in a way, radically illegal, or at least to some degree a dangerous move from the level of whether it's legitimate or not. It's psychologically, that communicates something from government about how it operates and how it wants to manage its assets. Perhaps there's an incentive there, something going beyond simply the numbers getting here about how the government, through managing its assets, relates to its subjects and their sense of involvement and their sense of duty or otherwise to it.
I think there could be a case for. I think some people will look at a case for judicial review of this decision. I think lots of people are taking legal advice on it. The issue is that student loans are outside of any Consumer Credit Protection Act. The ones I took out in the early 90s were hidden under the aegis of the Consumer Credit Act. The loans since 1998 don't, because they were considered to be low-interest loans. And unfortunately, everyone has signed a loan agreement with a clause that says, I agree to repay my loan in line with terms and repayments that are in place at the time of repayment. Future governments may amend terms and conditions. So it's in everyone's loan agreement.
Conditions of the terms and conditions.
Yeah. So that's that's in there, and again, no one's ever, people weren't alerted to that. So there's a sense in which there's a mis-selling scandal here, but it would involve, it's going to require sort of political energy. You know, in a sense, the government's put it out for consultation, so take the opportunity to express your opposition, and then see if they push through with it in the face of that opposition. I think they know they're on tricky ground with this. Because, you know, everyone understands the idea that you make a promise to people. You know, even if you can kind of get a legal get out. Right. So, I mean, I wanted to conclude on that because that's the sort of public information aspect. And again, it's one of these things where you have to kind of dig in. Lots of the politics around higher education now is unfortunately around the financing side, and that's not something we're used to dealing with. And it's to sort of emphasise that these changes can be made by the Secretary of State without a vote in Parliament. The legislation has been written in such a way that these powers have been delegated. They're administrative matters. They're decisions that are made by ministers, not stuff that has to go to Parliament to get passed. I think most of our sort of political agency is geared up around bills moving through Parliament or demonstrations outside Parliament. These things can happen quite quickly, under the radar, in some sense. And I've gone on quite a while, but I'll just conclude with some concluding remarks. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. If I were an academic, I would be quite happy about my impact or my research excellence framework submission. Universities are a privileged site for watching capitalism and current political ideology at work. There's something fascinating going on there. I mean, and the Treasury stuff is fascinating as well. But there's a real question about politically where are the points to intervene and what would effective political action look like. I'm particularly convinced that the next 5 years are going to be harder and much more radical for the university sector because you can't do any more tricks with loans. So universities were spared austerity. So yeah.
I was going to say, what about, you know how they're bringing in loans for MAs? Is that not another trick? Oh, no.
That was a coalition policy. I don't know if it's current government policy. So there's a number of things which were announced before May that it's not clear to me that are full steam ahead. Sharia compliant loans is another thing that's been announced but not being pushed through as far as I can see. The problem is that the numbers are hugely problematic, as you've kind of seen from the graphs I've shown you. And you imagine if people are graduating now, everyone's graduating now with loan debt. There's no maintenance grants for the graduate system. We're going to take out another 10,000 for MAs and another 25,000 for PhDs. Even from the Treasury point of view, you can pile this debt onto people, but what's their capacity to repay any of it? No one's really sure about that. And one of the things about the postgraduate loans is they may make you repay it concurrently, so that we're repaying the two loans at the same time. So instead of taking 9% over 21, they would take 18% of your income over 21,000, and that would really, I think that's just unaffordable for most people. What I would say is, again, one of the things that's kind of striking about the university financing is there's almost no evidence base available for university research. It's very hard to find anything that's useful for this kind of politics. I don't have any academic studies of disposable income of 20-year-olds at the moment to be able to say, are these changes affordable to people? There's very little evidence you can put from the government, and it hasn't commissioned any research on that. So it doesn't know what graduate finances will look like if you make them repay £300 a year, or let alone if they have to repay two loans at the same time. What was that?
Yeah. How does filing for bankruptcy affect you?
You can't discharge student loans in bankruptcy. They've been designed with things like you can't discharge student loans in bankruptcy.
I realise you mentioned something about being outside of certain.
Yeah, if you suffer an injury or an illness which makes you unable to work, they do get discharged.
So
that's why I wouldn't recommend repaying them early, because there is there are some insurance things built in. If you die, the debt's wiped out. So it's not passed to your next of kin or any other descendants or anything like that. Sorry.
Those terms,
That's in private, those things are in private legislation, they can't change.
I guess one of the other presumptions about graduates is that graduates are going to earn more than other people who are not graduates on the whole.
Yeah.
But that was maybe fine when most people weren't graduates, but when everybody's a graduate, then the graduates are going to be reduced to like an average wage or the sort of wage that everybody earns. And if 50% of the population become graduates, then maybe that will be comparable to the 50% of the population at the moment, who instead of earning 28,000, which is the average wage, 50% of the population currently earn 20,000 or below. So if half your country are going to be graduates and half the country is going to be earning below £20,000, then how are you going to get the repayments out of that anyway? There are not enough graduates.
Can I answer that by showing you a very interesting diagram? I wasn't going to talk about it, but I realised that this is an audience with sort of arts and humanities and fine art people in that this is maybe something you should see. This is the sort of stuff I do in my more technical policy papers. But the thing is, not all graduate earnings are the same. And the figures that we normally see in I'm not sure it's in this PowerPoint, but hopefully it is. The figures we normally see are across all subjects and all graduates with no differentiation. No, it's not this one. Yes. Okay. This is the kind of horror show for some people. I know it's late, but I think this is really important. Okay, this is. There's very little research on this. There's some very big research coming down the line, but it's repeatedly delayed. This is the individual net lifetime benefit, depending on what undergraduate degree you did. Okay, so here's the baseline. This is 0. If you are a man who did creative art and design degrees, you lose money because you never, this is for full-time degrees, you never make up the earnings you lost by being out of the labour market for 3 years. So this is why, this is not a mistake, this is why if you're a man and you do creative art and design, you're on the wrong side of the 0. So red is female, blue is male. The dotted line is the average, so average graduate return, and then then it's broken down by subject. So male graduates in general get a benefit of £82,000 in lifetime earnings. Female graduates female are 82, and men is 120,000. But you can see, I don't need to go through each thing, you can see how uneven this is. Here's the sort of literature, languages, history, philosophy, creative arts and design. You're not seeing an awful lot of return. Medicine and dentistry, they borrow much more money because it's 6-year degrees, but they earn so much more over their lifetimes that they will repay their loans. Law is obviously a very interesting one. Huge disparity between male and female graduates in that industry, largely because of the structure, the self-employment structure of barristers and partners.
And again, this is the situation now when graduates are a scarce resource, and graduates are more available than these we have there.
So this is these are figures that were produced in 2011. There's some better in the sense of more up to date and maybe more. Well, I won't talk about that before because it's not here yet, and I'm not really sure what it's going to say. But this is obviously correlated to loan repayments. If you're in one of these are your this is the boost to your net lifetime earnings. It also tells you how much additional loan repayments you're likely to make. The government is extremely concerned about funding people £40,000, £50,000 if they're not going to repay any of it. This is like the next battleground in higher education policy. It's why do we fund so many students to do media studies, mass communication, languages, creative arts and design, and philosophy when it's so expensive? They don't repay their loans will be the discourse. So most of the figures we can talk about is 45%. 45% of what the government loans to students is not coming back, and that's everybody. Some of these subjects, you're going to be lucky to see any return at all from, if you're the government, from loaning money to men to do fine art degrees. But the point is, this is coming down the road. This is like the next phase. If they're worried about loan repayments, then they won't just. Then they'll start looking by subject. Some of these subjects have got huge numbers of students. I mean, you don't have to be. You can. Let's say you're David Willits, who's married to Sarah Butterworth. You might know her as a painter. He can quite clearly say, "I'm not a Philistine, but do we need 150,000 art design students funded by government? And we just need 70. Maybe I only like University of Arts London and Slade and Goldsmiths." There's a policy question here about which is manpower planning. To use the old phrase. Why do we fund higher education? If we think it's because it's a boost of human capital, people get the benefit of lifetime earnings, those people repay more to the exchequer, then this chart should worry people. So my sort of the last phase there's a lot of complaints about the last phase of government reform, that it was biased against the arts and humanities. My sense was at that point it wasn't. It was largely about liberalising business and various accounting and law degrees in particular, was where they thought there would be most competition. But this next phase, which is largely going to be based around dependence and whether institutions provide training that boosts graduate salaries. If you're going to go to university and you want because you want a good job with higher earnings, the government can simply publish this information or ask you to put it in your key information sets, those of you who do university. Anyway, that was my chart for your question. The government believes markets will solve this problem. And they don't want to have to go in and tell universities, like they've just done in Japan. The Japanese government has just said, you aren't to offer any more liberal arts or social science degrees because they're not good for the country. And 17 universities have just shut down their liberal arts and social science. The government here doesn't want to do that because that's a political nightmare. But they believe market forces, if you put the information out, people who are rational, informed consumers, will look at this and make certain decisions. Anyway.
Is there a move to do that with the lifting the capital match students can be enrollment so that it's sort of opening up the subjects to the market more?
Yes. Let me just see if I've got the. Okay, so this is the report, the new research coming through that I was telling you about, and this is their blurb. Different degrees from different institutions result in very different levels of learning. Students with similar pre-university qualifications from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, and this might affect both student choice and policies designed to increase participation and improve social mobility. I think this policy will be couched in language that looks equitable. It'll be saying to students, actually don't really know what the implications of your choice of degree are, so we provide you with more information to help you make your decision. I'll say something else. What was your question again?
It's kind of tied up into, I don't know how universities fund certain departments, but like recently having a number of students that can be involved in certain areas, and as far as I don't even know if that's the case. But if more students apply to do medicine and dentistry or veterinary...
These are still capped, medicine and dentistry. Yeah. Because they also put in £10,000 a year of grant to the universities for those students, so those are capped. What I would say is, you probably picked up discussion of the new thing coming through, which is the teaching excellence framework, that's likely to be a kind of grab bag of statistics, and some of it will be things like the national student satisfaction, but this is also likely to go into any teaching excellence framework assessment. Do you provide this training? If you take students from certain economic backgrounds, do you genuinely boost social mobility? The best way they think to measure that is through change in lifetime earnings. So that would be a performance indicator in a certain sense. Yeah.
Another way the male is in minus of the
Yeah.
I don't get that. Why are they in minus something else? If they don't think through?
Well, I mean, women benefit from going to university. That's on this measure. Any woman with a degree will earn more on average than someone with equivalent pre-18 qualifications who chooses not to go to university. But if you're going to study full-time, you're not in the job market between 18 and 21. So if you're measuring all of the earnings you make over your whole lifetime, compared to someone who didn't go to university, there are 3 years where they're earning and you're not. And that's the minus here. No, sorry, I'm not someone who thinks no one should do final degrees. I'm someone who's saying this is right.
Because obviously if I am a girl doing design, for instance,
Yeah.
we know that after graduation there's more males. A boy in finance but the really big students finance. So why are they in the minds? So they not make power after they graduate.
What you have to imagine is two 18-year-olds who both get the same qualifications. One chooses to go to university and one doesn't. So two females. So the woman who goes to university does better. But compared to men, she may not earn as much. But it's about the choice you make at 18. So are we over?
No, we're just ticking. Time on student loans.
So student loans are technical, but this is the problem. This is what politics is going to be driven by. They're going to tell you, well, you don't even know how to discount a cash flow, so how can you even participate in our technical conversation about higher education policy? And they'll say that, and then they'll say that, like, from a social mobility perspective, it's better that we get students from certain backgrounds to do these degrees than to do these degrees. That's what the argument will look like. I'm not saying I'm ventriloquising, let's say. And this is sort of my problem at the moment, is that universities haven't really grasped this is coming down the line. They're still making the case to government on the basis of, we need this much money to provide the education. But the government is increasingly thinking about higher education, not how much does it cost to provide degrees, but how creditworthy are individuals and institutions. If we lend money to these people, how much do we get back? And if you're an institution that's got a high-cost subject, like art and design provision is high cost, government is going to be less inclined to fund so many students if very few of them make any repayments.
Is this informing what's happening at sort of below higher education, like secondary level education, and that's the EBAC and things like, it seems to be, or the sort of EBAC framework, which is wiggling down some of those areas already in terms of that similar rationale in relation to history. So it's not just alone working down the road. It feels like that could be a mix of those policy decisions that are happening also within individual schools who are deciding even independently EBAC to have those programs.
You already see it at FE level for over 24s, and it will increasingly come in, I think, for 19 plus. There's still a sort of political agreement that loaning, I don't think it's legal to loan money to those under 18 to pursue their education. And no one, I think, will take it that far.
Companies are going into high schools and training the students. Like they're doing low literacy, that stuff that could be teaching in the schools right now.
But the government couldn't move to loan fund secondary education, but it can loan fund further education for people over 19. Their apprenticeships could be loan funded. But I mean, it's not robust yet, shall we say.
Yeah, no, I was more wondering the kind of there's the threat of kind of closing down these departments because they're not engaged or they're not in enough programming. But it seems to be they're already kind of starting to cut the feeders into those programs because they're cutting the feeder programs seem to find
so schools are encouraged, are measured on students doing certain subjects. It doesn't include art and design, but the students are less likely to have the qualifications. Yeah.
But if the higher earning caps, there's only a limit, isn't there, how many they can get in. But if their model is relying on kind of increased student numbers, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? There's going to be less courses for people to, unless it's those kind of...
Less diversity, but there might be the same number of places, but just not the right subjects. The uncapping may be a bit of a red herring here, because the uncapping is largely to do with a different aspect of a supply-demand model. They think in neoclassical economics, if you have a restriction on supply, it drives up price. And if you want universities to compete on price, you have to take the numbers off. You've got to if you want them to lower prices to pursue recruitment, you've got to take the cap off, because otherwise everyone just goes to the cap. Sorry, not the fee cap, but the recruitment cap.
But certain disciplines are still capped, right?
Yeah, medicine and dentistry, because the government still gives large amounts of money per student for those subjects. So if you're doing medicine, you will face a 9,000 fee, but the government's giving the institution £10,000 in grant alongside the 9,000.
So would that mean could that mean in practice shifting money from, say, humanities to medicine, increasing medicine, bolstering up departmental?
Well, I mean, there's two different levels of this. One is if I'm a university funding my activities, and over here I'm a government providing the university with money to fund its activities. I'm loaning to the student. So as a creditor, I'm going to be happy lending to the people who I think are going to repay more. As a university, I might want to recruit these subjects because I think I can provide them for less than £9,000. So I think I can do history for 7,000. I charge 9,000. I've got 2,000 per student. I can use that elsewhere. So the incentives at the moment for institutions, because they're not chasing their cost base, they're just pitching a maximum tuition fee, is they'll be recruiting these students because they're the ones that give them the most surplus. The government's unhappy with that because they're the students that aren't going to repay. So you've got a conflict of interest in the system. So you've got to incentivise universities differently. And this is why there was a lot of talk last year about getting universities to buy their own student loans. Because at the moment, if I can borrow Andy, I need another volunteer. I need 2 volunteers. I just need another volunteer for participation. I'm the government, you're the university, you're the student. I give you I give you 20. It's a 3-year degree. I give you £27,000. What do you do with the money?
I spend it on my.
So you give it to the university. What happens at the end of the degree? You can walk away. You've got that £27,000. The debt relationship is between me and Andy. I've lent money to Andy. The universities no longer, as they say, got skin in the game.
So they've made money.
Yeah. So if I've got them to buy the loan I've made to the student, Andy would be repaying to him. So he would be incentivised to boost his graduate repayment profiles because he would get more money back. That's what David Willis was talking about last year. Universities would buy their own loans and then they would worry about what happens in what's wrong? Okay, so here's the projection. I've got to make sure Andy repays me for 30 years. The university is not in the picture. So what I want to do is somehow get the universities to care about this. Get the universities to encourage their students to repay more, or teach them stuff in the first place and then they can repay more, or give them free careers advice, or allow them to come back and do MAs if they weren't in employment for free in order to have an ongoing relationship with them.
But isn't this potentially going to saddle universities with...
Yes.
Isn't it a risky strategy to saddle universities with that amount of debt?
Yeah, I mean, it's cloud cuckoo land. I mean, This is
It's like PFI for universities.
the annual turnover of the English university sector is 24 billion, 25 billion a year. The government's going to be issuing £15 billion of loans a year. Right, within 2-3 years, if universities bought all that loan debt off the government, their balance sheets would just be absolutely saturated. I mean, they just don't have the capacity to take on that horror. So it's again rambling away from topic here, but on technical stuff. The government's idea was that universities would partner up with money funds like pension companies or insurance companies or hedge funds and create like a special purpose vehicle where the university might have 10% of it or 5% of it, and then they would have the big money fund providing the balance sheet. Obviously, what on earth kind of institution would that be? I mean, there used to be a joke about Harvard and Yale that they were endowment funds that do a bit of teaching and research. But we would have, what Willis was proposing was a kind of hybrid money fund, where universities would be a very, very junior component.
Isn't this like PFI though? Isn't this like with PFI hospitals? Isn't this just very, very similar?
This is a PFI style problem.
Yeah.
What you've got is the loans are on the balance sheet, and what you desperately want to do is to get the loans off the balance sheet, and you've got to find purchasers. How can you do that? If you persuade universities to set up a special purpose vehicle to do it, then it would look very much like PFI. That's what they do for a lot of student housing, is they set up a special purpose vehicle. A bank and a construction company sets up a student accommodation special purpose vehicle. They enter into some complicated contract with the university to supply the students, but then they build, it's called DBFO, Design, Build, Finance, Operate. That's off balance sheet, but it's lots of university accommodation is like that.
But then at least there you've got property, so you've got equity in something. Whereas with this, it doesn't have that, does it?
Well, it's crazy talk. Nobody should have taken data seriously last year.
But surely
for the last 5 years.
Can I go back to your question about what should be done?
Yeah, so it's maybe a good to move on to.
Because I'm just conscious of the fact that there's 2 universities in this city.
Yeah.
And that we have access to a lot of students, so maybe there's something that can be done. It's just kind of idea that can be used here would be useful to.
If there's marketing in this one.
Well, I think the first thing is, do your students know that they're facing a retrospective price hike? That's the first thing. There will be some campaigning around this in the next few months, but the consultation closes on the 14th of October. But I think there's a general issue that somebody mentioned this, getting the banks in to teach students about loans. Preparing them for finance, but in many ways that's ambiguous. How do we avoid finance in our lives? Sometimes I think this is the problem with maybe people who like Danny Gorlick, who think that all this finance stuff is just all about the 1% exploiting us, but we're entrapped in finance. Who here doesn't have a pension, insurance, a loan of any kind, a mortgage, etc.? I'm quite in favour of more financial literacy, but
also it sounds that somehow there's a requirement for the NUS to take up some technical positions it can argue about, whereas when I was at university, the NUS was not shy of taking up purely political positions. So this seems, apart from the technical aspects, this is a transference of public money into private accounts. And this is a mechanism to channel public funds through the student loan system into the hands of financiers. And that's a larger political issue. So is the NUS now a political organisation? It says, well, because we have such a diversity of students, we can't take up such a political position. We have to just address these little technical arguments in the contracts.
Well, I don't want to put words in the NUS's mouth, but somebody did mention postgraduate loans, and the NUS have been campaigning for postgraduate loans for quite a while because they see it as an equity issue, a social mobility issue, because it's an MA that gives you access to professions these days, and if there's no loan funding for it, you have to get some other kind of commercial loan. Perhaps they think that if you tighten up undergraduate loan repayments and you freeze it there, then the postgraduate loan is more likely to come to appear. At the moment, I'm I'm not sure about that, but you can see that maybe there's a strategic decision to say, we accept this, we'll oppose grants, we'll accept the freeze on loans, but because we think that's more likely to give us postgraduate loan funding. I just don't think at the moment postgraduate loan funding is working, but there's a lot of desire for it. I did want to sort of conclude with some lessons. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of finance tonight, and as I said at the beginning, I'm kind of sorry for that, but I'd like it to be otherwise. But I think this is where, unfortunately, where the action is at the moment. This is like the sharp end of British politics. There's a reconfiguration of the state going on, and often that involves changing the balance sheet and changing how things go through the accounts. And as I said, I've had to teach myself this, but I still feel that, there's a bigger problem. I send this information out, or I give a presentation, but really, where does it latch onto? Who's got any apparatus to make use of this information politically? Particularly because this is the second point, and I'm not a Labour Party member. I did work with the Labour Party last year. Excruciatingly incompetent. I expected politicians to be kind of numerate, particularly when they've got MBAs and they've got teams of graduates working for them. But there's something, we can kind of see it once, 15 people walk away from Corbyn's shadow cabinet and kind of begin to go, look, these other people lining up to take these huge departments. One of the problems with Labour is that Labour put in place all of the legislation that the coalition government used. The 2008 Sale Student Loan Act, in many ways, there didn't need to be a higher education bill last Parliament because all the legislation was there waiting to be used. Labour had this internal problem, which was figures like Mandelson, Clark, etc. were pretty much on the same page as with it and saw it as continuing what they'd begun. Internally, the Labour Party couldn't decide whether it was pro-market in universities or not, whether it was in favour of these alternative providers or not. Didn't know whether it was in favour of sale of student loans or not. Just didn't have these bigger policy issues decided. So they were always looking for a very quick opportunist hit. But they failed, and as you probably realise, there was no higher education policy from Labour going into the election. They made 6,000 feet pledge, but it wasn't policy. And that's a general problem we face about capacity, because there's no golden age, but there's a certain case in which you thought if you give good and solid goal information to politicians, they could make something of it, but they singularly failed to do that. The other thing is, I just don't think universities have done what they should have been doing. They saw their interests as being served by making sure they got as much income as possible, and they've not taken up any other fight. They've been completely oblivious to sort of self-pride in higher education or how it feeds into them. And they don't see this stuff coming down the line, but they're putting in place everything the government needs to kind of take control of their finances in a very different way. I mean, it's not as if loans are going to free them up. You've still got to have access. Fees don't liberate universities because you've got to have the access to the loans to be able to charge fees to students in a way that they can afford to repay it. So it's a sort of false autonomy that they're being offered, I think, at the moment. You can kind of ignore the rest of the points that perhaps they weren't really touched on in the debate. So I don't know. Do you want to try and bring it back to what was discussed this afternoon? Or we kind of probably run out of time.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me, knowing you already, knowing that your PhD happened was originally on Walter Benjamin, wasn't it?
It was actually worse than that, but that's not good.
But you've moved into and picked up a whole load of skills really, really quickly. Journalism, the financial news, and you're now doing stuff on the market. You've clearly gone through quite an intense learning process to come to be able to do something that has political purchase over. And that I think in itself is very impressive, and an example of a kind of way of thinking about and doing research. It's kind of in the background to what we think. So there's not really a question. It's just you've been very modest about actually what you've done, I think, and I think it's just worth it, just pointing out that there's been this kind of intense and very well executed learning process in all parts to work with this stuff together.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that. But what I guess I would say is I don't think it was a kind of surprise to me that there weren't experts in this field. I think most people, I've been around universities for a long time, and I kind of assumed that somewhere in some institution there would be an academic that this was their area and they knew about it, and it just wasn't. It wasn't there. It was a real. I was able to move into it because nobody was there, and everyone who worked on it in some ways kind of did it as a hobby and knew a little bit about something but didn't really know the detail. And I think one of the things I learned quite quickly was you couldn't trust professors to be able to tell you what was happening inside government. I mean, a lot of their information was just so out of date on the actual practices. I mean, I think some people have also seen this around the Bank of England's money creation documents they've recently put out. I mean, this basically says the way banking is taught in economics degrees is nothing like what we do in day-to-day practice. And this, I think, is the same with student loans. Everyone thought student loans was not too difficult a concept. You loan money to people and they hopefully pay it back. How can it be so tricky? But in fact, it's got its own section in the consolidated budgetary guidance put out by the Treasury. And to be honest, the thing is, 10 years ago there would have been no need to do this. It just really wouldn't, because most university income was pretty straightforward. Most of it came from government. If you were having battles with institutions, as everyone was, it was of a different order. It wasn't driven by this kind of financing problem.
Practically speaking, would it not be possible to take out your own private loan, pay for your education, and then go bankrupt?
I think you'd struggle to find it. I would do so. I've had a look at some of the options available, and they're quite interesting.
That was the strategy when they in Canada when they introduced student loans. We had a debt non-repayment movement, which was essentially people were planning to go bankruptcy and not paying loans. But then over time, the loan companies assigned that as a non-payment strategy.
Credit card is tighter than it used to be, but before the financial crash, I think we managed £40,000 on credit cards. No evidence of buy of any long-term at all.
Andrew, could you say something about could you say something about the kind of support you've had from the Guardian and space and what they've given you to...
Is it turned off? Is it turned off now?
Could I suggest that we sort of round off the official? Yeah.
Okay.
And just thank Andrew very much for his talk, and then we'll pick up your question very much for that. So we'll let Andrew sit down and have a bit.
I'm just sorry, I'm just turning it off.